So, like a good nerd, I started a blog. I had that tech background that I put to good use. And if anyone's ever started a blog, they know you write to crickets chirping. Nobody ever reads it because they don't know about it. So I actually went to recruit people. There was a site at the time, hugely popular, called the Raving Atheist, and he was a vitriolic anti-Christian, like would set your monitor on fire, some of the stuff this guy would write. But some Christians, I guess, felt called to sort of minister to him and his readers. And so there were a lot of debates among Christians and atheists, and so I just started recruiting them. I would take the Christians who did the best job of defending their beliefs in the most reasonable way, in a way that I could relate to, and I would just email them and say, hey, come answer questions on my blog, and some of the atheists came over too. And long story short, I realized two things. One of them was that all these people who did the best job with the atheists, they would just make mincemeat of these atheist arguments, I found out after I'd started corresponding with them, they were all Catholic, which was very interesting to me, because I had all these negative stereotypes about the Catholic Church. The other thing that was interesting is they pointed out what I was missing in all my flailings, with reading the Bible. They said when God inspired fallible, sinful people to write the infallible words of the Bible, he never stopped doing that. Jesus founded a church that he still guides to this day. And they said, that is the authority that you're looking for. That's the missing piece of the puzzle. And I had to admit, it made a lot of sense. On paper, this theory sounded right, but the Catholic Church, are you kidding? And Joe, having been raised Baptist, he had a lot of anti-Catholic views, so we both just said, no way. But we also didn't know where else to turn, so we thought, we'll just read a few books to see why they're wrong. And then I'll get back to my readers and I'll explain, the error of their ways. And it was probably one of the most shocking things of my life when I actually let the church speak for herself instead of taking these half-truths that I'd heard in the culture and the bitter ex-Catholic neighbor who occasionally spewed something about what the church teaches. When I actually read books by, say, G.K. Chesterton and some of the modern people like Scott Hahn and Mark Shea, it was stunning that this was the most reasonable, seamless belief system I had ever encountered. In fact, it was so reasonable that it made me think, I don't know if I give people enough credit to come up with something like this. I don't know if people can come up with this. I think that this might take something outside of humans to get this kind of wisdom and keep it going for 2,000 years. And in particular, I was shocked that I came to agree and see, in fact, the beauty of the church's teaching on abortion and contraception. I had just assumed going into it that even if I were to start going to a Catholic church, obviously I'd blow off that. And really, I thought contraception was like air and water, like things that are universally good with no downside. But when I, again, let the church speak for herself, I found that this was actually the best news in the world, that the church was absolutely right about it. And that, unfortunately, that's a whole separate talk that I don't have time to go into, but that story is on my blog if you're interested. It's on the left side. But I encourage you, I will say, if anyone struggles with that teaching, it is probably the church's hardest teaching. I do encourage you to pray, open your heart, and just read what the church has to say for herself on this issue, because it's really amazing and life-changing, as I can say from personal experience. So anyway, I start writing about this on my blog, this is so beautiful, guys, just give the church a chance, this is wonderful. And I was pregnant with my second child at the time, and then I got a deep vein thrombosis, which is a life-threatening blood clot in a major vein. And it turns out that it was actually from a genetic clotting disorder that is pretty rare, and I inherited from both parents. So, Dad, if you want to tell the truth that you met Mom at a family reunion or something, that's okay. But the doctors didn't know what to do with me because this disorder is so rare that I would have both copies of this gene. They said, you can't have any more pregnancies. It's too dangerous. And I had to take a drug to treat the clot for months postpartum that is so dangerous for pregnancy that they in fact encourage women to get sterilized before they take it. And so I thought that was a little funny addition to follow up my posts of like, guys, this teaching is so beautiful. And now we had medical bills piling up. I'd been going to midwives, and I had to have this high-risk birth at the hospital. We didn't have insurance that covered pregnancy. Basically, my conversion turned into a hot mess. And so Joe and I really, thought and prayed about what to do about this, because we had intellectually come to agree with this, but I had these doctors saying, you're the exception, you don't have a choice, you have to use contraception. And a lot of people around us said, aha, you are exactly the example of why the church is totally unfair. Those celibate guys in the Vatican, let them have your problems for a day and, then see what they have to say about it. But what we realized from all of this, research and thinking, and just, again, my background of being intellectually honest, was that when you're evaluating anything the church teaches, or anything about Catholicism, there is only one question to ask. It's actually quite simple. Is this church guided by God in its teachings or not? It's that easy. If the answer is no, then there's no need to believe anything it teaches, starting with its claim that it chose the correct books for our Bibles that we use. And if the answer is yes, that the church is guided by God, then to say that you know better than the church is to say that you know better than God. And so that's the question we asked. And we came to the conclusion that we believe this is true, we believe this teaching is from God, and so I guess you'll work it out. And that's where we learned that God does not ask us to have all the answers or to have a perfectly clear roadmap of how things are going to turn out. He just asks that we be faithful. And so we decided to become Catholic and to be faithful Catholics, to follow the church's teaching. And when we look back on our decision, we realized, for one thing, this was the most reasonable belief system we had ever encountered. To this day, I still think that atheism is a fairly reasonable belief system, but the Catholic Church is just more reasonable, by far. The Catholic Church also answered that question of by what authority. The Bible doesn't interpret itself, so would God just leave us hanging like that? The founding fathers gave us the Constitution and obviously understood that you can't just hand out a copy to each person and say, well, you see what's there, it should be fine. They gave us the Supreme Court, and it just made sense that God would give us his own divinely guided Supreme Court. It also answered those questions about literacy and the printing press, and what did people do before they could own Bibles and they couldn't read? And, for 3 centuries, Christians didn't even have a Bible. And so the Catholic Church answered all those questions. And this was actually shortly after the first rounds of sexual abuse scandals. And so we heard a lot of that, like, oh, how can you join this church when you see what kind of people it has? First of all, obviously we saw that the numbers of priests accused were about the same rates as male public school teachers. I mean, the media had widely exaggerated what was going on. But it was kind of interesting that what Joe and I saw is the more the world tried to make the case that the Catholic hierarchy was filled with all these nasty, corrupt people, the more it convinced us that the claims of Catholicism are true. Because sinful, corrupt, prideful people are always the first to sell out, to change their minds, to go with the world just to get more money and more fame and popularity. And here's the church who is like infuriating people for 2,000 years because it will not back down on what it teaches about all these really unpopular issues. And sinful, corrupt people, they can't keep that going. They can't do that. And so interestingly, the scandals actually only convinced us further that this is a church whose teachings are guided by God. And what I found, that all those rules that were so derided by the culture, the church's confining laws, and once I actually lived them, I didn't experience them as something that infringed my freedom. I realized that it was actually just a prescription. It's like a prescription that a doctor gives you for living a life of love. You don't have to follow the prescription, but why wouldn't you want to? And it's interesting that all those problems we had, the medical bills piling up, being told I had to take contraception and all that, when it first came up, it looked like there was no way this was going to work out. This was too much of a mess. But when we prayed and we stayed faithful, it was the first time that I ever really saw God move in a big way, in a big, like, you can't deny that there is something going on here way, that just one thing after another worked out. You guys have probably experienced that in some point in your life, when you take a risk, you stay faithful, and things that should not work out, they just amazingly work out. And so my husband and I both became Catholic. We entered the church at Easter Vigil in 2007. We were actually the first RCIA class to go through in the new building, so that was really neat for us. And through it all, this was still at the time when we still had a lot of medical bills, and we actually had a surprise pregnancy come up right after the pregnancy, where my doctor told me we couldn't have any more kids, so they were kind of horrified by that. And in the midst of all this chaos, we realized that life doesn't have to be easy to be joyful. Our lives didn't get easier when we became Catholic. In fact, by worldly metrics, they got quite a bit harder. We had much less money, 5 kids in 6 years. It's been tough, but all you need is God, and you'll have joy. You don't have to have an easy life. You just have to have a Christ-filled life. And so, on a final note, one kind of nice addition to the story is, remember the Raving Atheist blog, the Militant Atheist blog. About a year or two after I became Catholic, I went back to check his site just to maybe pray for him, see what was going on. And he had a big announcement saying, I have accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And he's now Catholic. And so, in conclusion, I hope that by sharing my story, I've taught you, one, just some things that I found compelling about the Catholic Church. I hope that none of you are ever afraid to question your faith. I know that sometimes when we have atheist friends, families, or coworkers, there can be this sense of, like, maybe I shouldn't engage them because what if they're right? They have some good points. Be not afraid. Don't ever be afraid to ask all the tough questions. The more tough questions you ask of the church, the more your spiritual life will grow and the more faithful Catholic you will be. And finally, I hope that my story teaches you that nobody is beyond God's grace. Don't ever give up hope for yourself or someone you love. Nobody is beyond the reach of God. And people a lot of times ask, is my life better now that I've become Catholic? And I wouldn't so much say that my life is better now as much as I would say my life has started now. Thank you.